Inspiration for Teachers podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm super excited to be joined alongside this week's guest, Elisheva. She's going to be discussing with us a fantastic topic that personally I'm super enthusiastic about. I have some history in dyslexia in terms of I did some research for it when I was doing my master's degree, and wow, the subject is just so mind-blowing. And as teachers and educators, we need to really understand the dyslexic mind, because we have lots of children coming through the education system that have these issues and varying degrees of difficulty in the classroom when they're trying to access our curriculum. So we really need to get a good grasp talking about it. So the show is going to be slightly different today. But the first thing I want to do is welcome our excellent guest. So please, Ellie, can you take it away?
Sure. Hi, Kelly. It is so nice to be on the other side of the mic. Thanks for hosting.
Oh, you're so welcome. I just want to get inside your brain and learn everything that you know. Can you start off by telling our listeners a little bit about who you are?
My name is Elisheva Shwartz, and I have a podcast called the Dyslexia Quest, which is really about creating a space for dyslexic adults to come together and explore what is the mystery of the dyslexic mind. Each episode, I have a different interview, and I have a combination of people that are doing the most cutting-edge research in dyslexia, because I've always been completely fascinated and taken by the research process, and not only looking at individual case studies, which happens when you interview specific dyslexic individuals, but looking at the research on a much broader level, like what patterns are we seeing? And at the same time, I talk to really fascinating dyslexic adults that are very successful. I've talked to Pulitzer Prize-winning authors, Emmy Award-winning filmmakers. I've talked to politicians. I've talked to a lot of multimillionaire businessmen. And along with that, what I also do is I'm involved in all sorts of education and advocacy around dyslexia, and I'm completely taken by this emergent movement that's kind of come up from the ground, which is right at its genesis. It's right at the beginning, but it's so exciting, called the neurodiversity movement. I don't know if any of you guys have heard about it, but I'm sure many of you guys have thought about diversity. And now many people, especially dyslexics themselves and ADHD individuals themselves and Asperger's individuals themselves, are saying that we no longer want to be viewed as if we're less than other people, as if we're catching up and we're trying to be just like the quote-unquote neurotypical mind. We want to be celebrated for our differences.
You see, this is why I'm so curious about this topic, and I'm sure so many of our listeners are going to feel the same way, because to get inside that mind and to view it from a different perspective, I think it can only help from where I'm coming from in terms of teaching, because once you understand the creative processes involved in helping somebody to understand a topic associated with any subject, but also how they learn that through that process that they go through, I think it can only benefit everybody else, and it can be a really interesting slant on how we teach a whole community of learners, not just necessarily pigeonholing people and saying, right, well, you're the dyslexic, or you've got ADHD, and so I need to do this strategy for you and this strategy for you. But if we were to take it all into how we deliver lessons and how we help people learn, I think it would be a much more creative environment and a much more nourishing environment for people to experience. Don't you think, Ellie?
Absolutely. And I am actually so enthusiastic right now that I'm talking to a whole bunch of teachers, because when I sit down with the most, successful and productive dyslexic adults on my show, so many of them become teary-eyed and they start crying on the mic talking about their early school experiences. And it doesn't matter if they're, have grown a company to the multiples of millions, or I had a nationally syndicated radio host who his show was on 150 different radio channels in America, very successful, started, crying when thinking about school. And I think that the change has to happen from the ground up, and teachers are involved in so many of these formative memories that make us who we are and that help us create our stories about if we're good, if we're bad, if we're smart, if we're stupid. Like, teachers are such a pivotal and important part of anybody's journey, story, and history.
So we're going to bridge a gap between your knowledge and what I know from a teaching perspective, and we're going to bring it all together. So let's start by putting you under the lens, because you've got a personal insight into dyslexia. So let's put you under the lens and let's talk about your story as what you felt like when you were in education, and we'll talk about ways in which we can improve, the way in which teachers think about how to help that dyslexic child in the classroom. So can we go to your personal story and what it felt like for you to be a dyslexic in a classroom?
Sure, absolutely. But actually, before I get into my story, I just want to give a quick definition of what dyslexia is. I think dyslexia is often talked about just in popular conversation so much that sometimes we use the incorrect definitions, and sometimes people think of dyslexia, they think of switching words around in your head. People joke about that, or if they misread a number from 53, they say 35, they just joke and they say, oh my, I'm so dyslexic. But switching words and switching letters is not actually what makes somebody dyslexic. Actually, all children do reversals at some point, and then at some point it becomes developmentally inappropriate. And some dyslexics do reversals far later and all the way into adulthood. And I think that's where the myth came from, that people tend to associate dyslexia with those reversals, because often people that struggle with those reversals do have dyslexia. But so many people have dyslexia that don't struggle with reversals, and that happens all the time. And I actually was just speaking to a gentleman, and he was saying, I relate to so much of what you're talking about, but I don't read things backwards, and I don't read letters backwards. And I said, most dyslexics don't do that. There is a percentage of dyslexics that struggle with that, and often if you meet somebody that does do reversals, they're often dyslexic, but many dyslexics don't do the reversals, so we just have to put that big myth aside. And what dyslexia is, it's an alternate cognitive learning profile, so that means that it's a way of learning that is different from the typical brain. It's neurologically based, so they've done a lot of research where they map out the fMRIs, and they utilize all this brain technology to show that there are differences in the brain structure. It's significant differences, and it will come up on every brain analysis that you will do on the fMRI. So it's neurologically based, alternate way of processing information. And what it tends to happen is you have this trade-off, big picture thinking abilities at the expense of small details. So it's a brain that is basically wired for seeing the gist and the gestalt, and has a very difficult time with fine detailed tasks and automaticity. So reading is actually a very fine detailed task, because when you read, in order to be an effective reader, you have to be able to translate every single letter into a sound, and read every single word in the line accurately. You have to be very exacting. Also, processes like phonological awareness, which is recognizing two distinct sounds. So, for example, if I say the word oatmeal really quickly, oatmeal, it's really hard to hear the T in the middle, and it's really hard to hear the L after. So if I was talking to somebody who didn't know English, or if I was talking to a 1-year-old and I said oatmeal really quickly, very often they wouldn't hear that T in the middle, the t-t sound. So the part of your brain that says, there's a T inside oatmeal, is the very detail-oriented network of the brain. So all these detail-type tasks, which is knowing your left from right, rules, automating processes, dyslexic children have a difficult time with. And also something very important that I think we need to say is how frequent or how often do we find dyslexic individuals in the population. And what research is showing is that actually about 1 in 6 individuals are on the dyslexia spectrum. Every single teacher that will ever do anything with education will definitely come in contact with dyslexics without a question. And now I can tell you a little bit about my story. It would be my pleasure. I had a really good time in first grade. I did amazingly well. I loved the story. We would all sit around by my teacher and she would tell us these stories in history and in science. And I did really well. And actually, for years later, I would bump into my first grade teacher in the supermarket. And she would be like, "Hi, Elisheva," and she knew who I was. And even when I got fuzzy about like who she was, she still remembered me. And not only was I not struggling, but I really was one of the best students. And then second grade happened, and I went from being one of the best students to really struggling. And by third grade, I was very behind in the class, and I wasn't doing well. It was affecting my self-esteem. It came out as disciplinary issues in the classroom. I actually remember being kicked out in third grade and being sent to the hallway often and being so terrified. Like when I think about this terror right now, I can feel it in my belly, like being such a little third grader and being asked to sit in the hallway in this big school, and nobody else had ever gotten kicked out of class. But I just was really struggling to master the concepts that they were talking about and also exhibit this mastery from my teachers, get the positive reinforcement. I was really frustrated. I felt really out of place. And by the time I got to fifth grade, the principal of my school called my mom and she started telling her about all the help that I would need. And since about second grade, I was getting lots of help at home, tutoring and research room. And my mother's listening to this phone call, and she adds up all the hours that I would need extra help, and it was more hours than the hours in the week. And,
oh, my goodness.
And at that point, my mother said, maybe this school isn't the right fit for me, and I actually transferred to another school. And middle school was a little better. I really started to thrive as the information became more complex, and moved away from that rote learning the skills, because in the first couple of years you often spend a lot of time in school just learning the basic skills, and there's a lot of automaticity that your brain needs to pick up. You're learning how to write, maybe you're learning cursive, maybe you're learning multiplication tables. It's a lot of rules that have to be memorized, which is often very difficult for dyslexic students. And as I got to middle school, the information began to become more complex, and it's actually the complex thinking that dyslexic individuals tend to do better in, which is one of these major conundrums and mystery around this whole learning differences or learning disability conversation, is that people tend to think like, oh, this is a student, they're struggling so much in school, they're not getting good grades, they can hardly read, they can hardly write, let's loosen the load. And the way that they loosen the load is they loosen the wrong things. And the concepts and the ideas in the classes start to become too simple. So on the one hand, the kid or the student is struggling with all the things that a dyslexic mind may struggle, but they're also not getting that same sense of intellectual satisfaction from doing the things that they're really good at. And that's really what happened. By the time I got to high school, I was still struggling with a lot of very basic reading and writing tasks, but also a lot of the dyslexic strengths. And we'll talk about the 4 major strengths that science has clearly shown are associated with the dyslexic thinking process were not utilized in school. So it also started to feel like this extra limb that I was kind of carrying around. Like, sometimes you see a teenager that gets taller before any of their other kids, and they kind of hunch in their tallness. They don't know what to do with this height. And a lot of the dyslexic strengths that I have, I also started to get really, really frustrated because they weren't utilized. So very often, so frequently in school, and this has definitely happened in my experience, and almost everybody that I talk to, dyslexic adults, struggled with the same thing, is there's such a focus on remediating what's difficult, which is so important, but it's changing with technology, and as times are changing, we have to constantly be asking the question of, starting with the end in mind, what's the role of education, what do we want for our kids, and then how do we give them the tools to help them achieve that? But also not only spending 60, 70, 80% of the school time doing what they are terrible at, and also utilizing some of the school time to focus on their strengths. And I think this is really the question that researchers have been fascinated around dyslexia since dyslexia was discovered. at the turn of the 19th century, and the first time that we ever have a record of dyslexia was a German doctor wrote in his records that you had one of the most capable and bright students in the entire school, and he simply could not master learning how to read. And as the research on dyslexia has gone on, slowly that strength component of the diagnosis faded away, and we super focus on the difficulties. And, you know, this is a question that I join in conversation with a lot of the leading researchers on this issue. Like, what do standardized tests measure and what do they not measure? What do intelligence tests measure? What do they not measure? And it also made me really sensitive to the language that we use when we talk about things like intelligence. I was actually just at another lecture for teachers, actually, because I was going to meet somebody to do a collaboration with. And the lecturer just in conversation said, so what do we utilize to measure intelligence? And he said, well, IQ tests. And then he went on talking about another subject. And I think oversimplifications like that are very damaging because IQ tests measure a specific kind of intelligence. They do not measure the entirety of somebody's intelligence. And these are questions that are very hard to answer, right? Like, what is intelligence? How do we measure intelligence? How do we know who's intelligent and who's not? They're very difficult to answer. But I think we have to be constantly engaging in the questions. And I think the most important thing, which is what I'm really passionate about, is to never look at somebody based on one or two or a few measures and ever limit their potential. Because I think, and this has been based on my experiences, but also very inspired by a friend and big inspiration of my work, Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman at the University of Philadelphia, and author of an amazing book that every single one of you teachers should go out and buy called Ungifted. And Kelly, I don't know if you have show notes, but if you can link that up in the show notes.
We will put it up.
Yeah, so Ungifted by Scott Barry Kaufman, and he talks about how potential is a constantly moving target that's constantly interacting with engagement and interest. And what that means is basically you put an individual in an environment where there's engagement from bottom up, right? There's like this intrinsic interest. There's engagement and there's interest, and all of a sudden their potential grows and grows and grows. So the worst thing possible would be ever to look at a set of standardized test scores or look at an IEP or any other testing method or medium that you have, and to ever say that this student has less potential than another student, because potential is constantly growing based on what we put into it. Our engagement and our effort will constantly be moving that mark. And I also think that all the amazing research that has happened with dyslexia that shows that there's this cognitive trade-off. Because the brain is so good at some things, it struggles with some things. Or because the brain has struggled with certain things, it also has this different way of wiring that allows for these other abilities. It also makes us sensitive when we think about all ability and disability, right? Somebody might be really struggling with one thing that comes very easily to you as a parent or as a teacher or as a friend, but maybe that means that they also are fantastically amazing at something else that comes difficult to you. And the brain science is really showing this, that the brain works in terms of trade-offs, and especially in terms of extreme ability. If you have extreme ability in one place, sometimes you have a more difficult time to do something in another place. And that means that when we meet students that are really struggling with a particular task, we need to be curious about what maybe they're very good at. And we need to have reverence for their difference. So instead of thinking of like, hey, how can I make them be, this typical standard student who, maybe certain verbal linguistic tasks come easily or whatever it is, how can I have a certain reverence for who they are and celebrate who they are? And that is not to say that you shouldn't help them be the best student that they can be in the traditional setting, because if they're going to be stuck in the setting, you should definitely help them. You should definitely continue to work on things that are difficult for them. I'm not saying only focus on the strengths. I'm saying a certain posture of curiosity and reverence for who they are, even if it's very different from your processing style or very different from the style of an individual that does well in school in general. And I think this curiosity part is also very important because we're just at the beginning of understanding the power and the strength of these less typical processing styles. The science hasn't really borne out conclusively so much about what I'm sure we will find out in the future. And so before we come to judgments, we have to just be open and supportive.
Ellie, your passion is just so enthusiastic, and it's just kind of like, wow, this is just awesome. But I can also hear in my head all of the teachers' questions, because there is a spectrum of people with dyslexia, and you said from mild to profound. Most teachers will come into contact with children, unless they work in a specialist school, that are on the milder side of this spectrum. Now, you have to try and engage that child. You've got to try and support that child, and you have to help that child learn and develop. But you also have the other side of the coin, which is at some point they have to have their intelligence measured. And I don't necessarily agree with the way that we do that in education, but that is currently the scenario that we're in, that they have to be tested, and we have to measure them according to curriculum and according to other student outcomes as well. So the question that is just ringing in my head is, how do we support those learners in the way that we play to their strengths, but at the same time, at some point, they've got to sit down and take this test. Now, we do have the ability to give them a scribe so that they can help and they get extra time sometimes when they're taking a test. But how do we transition that dyslexic learner from the way in which they learn, how best to support them with that learning, to at some point you're going to have to take this test? How do we do that in the current situation that we're all in?
Oh my God, such a great question, Kelly, and I'm happy to answer it. Quickly, I would just like to say that I'm not sure if I agree with that assumption that most teachers will interact with people on the more mild end of the spectrum, because the fascinating thing about dyslexia is a lot of individuals that have significant dyslexia symptoms can have very strong compensatory qualities that a teacher might not even come across it. Like there's even a category in the research called stealth dyslexics, and these stealthy dyslexics sometimes, even though their decoding ability is tough for them, so that is like if you were to give them a nonsense words, right, made up words, and just have them decode it, they would have a really difficult time. But their reading comprehension, and that is if you give them long passages, they'll answer it and they'll completely understand it, is fantastic. And because what's actually happening is their ability to make sense out of incomplete data is so strong. So what's happening is their brains are drawing the lines between the dots really quickly. That's just a side point that very often, we might think that only the mild cases are coming into our classroom, when sometimes there are the profound cases with very strong compensatory abilities at the same time, so it might not come across. But then sometimes all of a sudden certain tasks would be very difficult for them. So for example, you have this kid that loves reading. They say, I love reading science fiction and I love reading Harry Potter and this and that. But then all of a sudden you have them read from the textbook and it's taking 3 times longer. And the reason for that is maybe it's unfamiliar words and terms, and it's expository reading instead of narrative. So when you're reading a story, even if you miss 3 or 4 words, especially if you have a brain that's wired for more creative thinking, you can just fill in the blank. I mean, all of our eyes actually do this when we see. We don't see a full image. We see dots of blackness in our image, and our brain just creates this perfect picture. So when a child is reading narrative, very often they can do that easily. But now when they're reading a subject that they know nothing about, so the terminology is unfamiliar, they don't have the prior knowledge in their head that they can make that context that can help them subconsciously understand what they're reading, even if their decoding is off, it becomes really difficult. And you have to be able to spot that out. And even if you tell the parent, I think your child is dyslexic, and they say, no, my child stays up till 3 o'clock in the morning reading with a flashlight, there's no way he's having difficulty. The second step, what I would do is just say, well, let's have him read these nonsense words and see if it's decoding, or maybe he's just so fascinated by the story that even if he misses a word here or there, his brain is so rapidly making sense of that. So I think it comes back to like a much broader question, which is like, how do we help people deal with things that are difficult for them? And there's fascinating research, but really interesting research that when they studied people who had experienced trauma, the healthiest people were not the people who had the least difficult lives, but the people who had the most coherent narratives and healthy stories around what happened to them. And I think that is the role for you as a teacher, especially dealing with a system that you don't have control. So very often, even if if a dyslexic child has to, let's say, take a test or an examination that you really think doesn't show their strength, if you can even sit down with the teacher and the parent and say, look, I am going to help you do as best as you can possibly do on this test, but maybe you won't do that great. And maybe your friend over here will do better and your friend over here will do better, but that doesn't mean that you're less intelligent. Like, if you begin these conversations about what intelligence and ability means and help people make sense of the madness, I think that's all people really want. I think these experiences do not become traumatic the way they have. So the way adults come on my show that are tremendously successful, award-winning and very wealthy, and they cry on my mic, I think that's because nobody sat down with them and said, I know you're not scoring well on the test, and I know that doesn't mean you're stupid. I see you. Like, I fully see you for your abilities far beyond this test. And that's all I think people ever want. And the same thing around IQ tests. I think that some people do well with IQ tests, but there are so many issues. I mean, I am so involved with talking to people in the research community around this, and IQ tests are very good at measuring specific skills and aptitudes. And when you have somebody who is not doing well in this IQ test, it's so important to talk to the parent and say, you know what, that does not mean your child necessarily is less intelligent. Because sometimes, limiting beliefs that the parent has will fall onto the child, and limiting beliefs that the teacher has. So to be able to make sense of the madness, I think, is so important. And of course, you're going to be working within broader systems. And I think people understand that they don't need to do well in every domain. I think people are comfortable with not always shining. I think people are extremely resilient, but the frustration comes when these dyslexic individuals don't feel seen. They don't feel seen and recognized for their full potential and ability because it's not coming up on the assessments. And sometimes all they need is a hug and a teacher to say, you know what, I see you. I see that you're wonderful, and I see that you're talented, and you're going to be doing just fine, even if you're doing badly on this test, and we're going to work to get you to do better, but maybe this will never be your playground. Like, maybe this will never be the place where you shine the brightest. But I know that there will be other places that you will.
From what I'm getting, dyslexia is a very complex subject, and they learn in very different and creative ways. A few of the things that I've picked up from you is that narrative is important, so the ongoing conversation is important about how the individual is doing, how they're learning, and supporting them. But then another two things that cropped into my mind was that you were saying about how you talk to a dyslexic individual is very important, that they miss out on key words or key letters. And then the other thing was they can answer quite complex problems. I mean, I've had experience where I've got a child in the classroom, and if I ask them to complete the answer to a question by writing it down, there's no way they could do that. But I have a verbal discussion with them about the topic, and whoa, they know what they're talking about. They're very intelligent. They've got that understanding there. They can give me definitions. So it's testing them in a different way. But from going forward with that, how do we talk to dyslexic individuals in the classroom better? So what do we need to be aware of when we're having that conversation? And then in terms of complex thinking, how can we develop better strategies so that we're engaging them more effectively in the classroom?
Yeah, wow. Those are very good questions. Okay, so in terms of talking to them, I think you mentioned, I'm not sure if this is your reference, but a little bit what I was talking about in the beginning with phonological awareness, like when I talked about oatmeal, like hearing the T sound. So I think that difficulty with phonological awareness, dyslexics tend to only really struggle with that when they're very young. So like all children struggle with that when they're learning how to talk. So like a 1-year-old, dyslexics may have more difficult time for that later on. But dyslexics tend to learn the language. They'll learn the language that's around them pretty easily, and they'll know the words. So the brain isn't breaking down the word and trying to hear the word every time. It just knows that word. Phonological awareness ends up being really a precursor for having a difficult time reading. So because that ability in the brain is difficult, it's a little bit complicated in terms of the brain science, but that's a precursor for difficult times reading. That's why I brought it up. So I wouldn't necessarily think about it, unless I was a preschool teacher, because most dyslexics, they can hear fine. I would think about it, though, when you're introducing new names and terminology and vocabulary that they've never heard before, to not race through it quickly. If you're not a foreign language teacher, it's not the top recommendation that I would have you thinking about when you're dealing with dyslexic students, because probably the majority of your conversations that you'll be having with your students will be on pretty familiar language. But if you are introducing new terms and vocabulary, either write it on the board so they can see all the sounds that are present, like if there's a hidden M or a hidden T or some of these other letters that get missed when people talk to them quickly. It is a very big issue, though, in a foreign language classroom. And that's why dyslexics have a very difficult time foreign languages for many reasons. The biggest reason is often they can't use their just general contextual thinking to understand what's going on because they don't understand the language to begin with. So you're having them listen to these words and break them down into independent sounds and maybe do the reading and decoding, but they can't use their big context thinking to understand what's going on. So foreign language can really, really be difficult for dyslexics for various reasons. Although I really believe that nothing is impossible, it's just how we go about learning. So I think that dyslexics can often do many things that are difficult for them. What's important is that you don't compare them to, the kid sitting next to them, because maybe it'll take them longer to get there. Maybe reading the word will take them longer. Maybe the speed will be harder for them, or the ease of reading will be harder for them, but you only compare them to themselves. And I think this is very important because we talk about teaching for dyslexic strengths. And sometimes, especially in dyslexic specialty schools or in special ed classrooms, what happens is dyslexics don't do any reading or any writing, and it's a very complicated subject. But I would hate to come across as saying dyslexics can't do that. I think it can be stressful if expected to perform in the same way and at the same rate or efficiency as their peers at the same age, because I think it is a little bit of just a different trajectory. But I think especially if there is a will, dyslexic individuals can often, they can do it. They can read and they can write. It shouldn't be a stressful experience. Sometimes you do have to test them on it, but then you can talk to them about it. Try to take away the level of judgment around it. So in the classroom before the test, I think that making sure that the dyslexics get enough opportunities to use their creative thought and enough opportunities to really engage in the information on a high level. And this is sometimes difficult, especially for profound dyslexics, especially in the younger grades. You see a student, they're failing every single spelling test they're doing. They don't know their multiplication tables, and they're in 4th or 5th grade. They seem to be just not doing well in school, and the tendency is to give them oversimplified information. And it happens over and over and over and over again. So what you have is you have a child that is not thriving in school, and you have a bored child. So I would encourage you to resist that temptation in terms of the content that's happening in the classroom. But if you needed to break it down into one sentence to keep in mind, I would say focus on their big picture strengths. It's that big picture ability that dyslexics really thrive in, and be conscious of the fact that it can really impact a child's self-esteem to not do well on tests. So even if you have to give them tests, just make sure to let them know that that doesn't define them and that doesn't define their abilities in general.
And where I'd like to take you to now is, I know that you have a lot of knowledge about technology that we can use to help dyslexics. So can you just expand on what would work well?
Yes. There is so much technology out there to help dyslexics, and it is the best time to be a dyslexic if you were to be a dyslexic at any time, because technology is so ubiquitous. So the first thing that I would say is audiobooks. And very often, this happens so often, dyslexic individuals think that they read well until they listen to an audiobook, and then they say, wow, it is a completely different experience, correctly and accurately and easily ingesting the whole content of the book. And it changes people's lives. So I think that especially when reading in school starts to happen instead of learning to read, but reading to learn, the technical just decoding, like even if you have a student that can read, but if their reading just is a little bit more laborious and a little slower than other people in the class, it really adds up and keeps them back. And the first thing as a teacher I would say is really encourage audiobooks. So there are several services where students can get audiobooks if they have dyslexia. So the second tip is around writing. So it gets a little complicated in school because different schools have different policies around like computers and technology in the classroom, but especially for homework, it is very easy on a Mac computer. It's built in, and on a Microsoft computer, it's so easy, and you can just Google to understand how to do these things. But your computer can read back the work that you write, which is so helpful for dyslexics because especially if it's that big picture thinking brain that doesn't necessarily pick up all the details and the inaccuracies. Very often, dyslexic individuals, especially as you see in middle school and high school where they really have writing for homework, will read their essay the way they want it to read. So if they wrote the word "and" twice, they just won't see it because that's a detail. And I think every writer has this to a certain extent. After they're working on a manuscript for a long time, they won't notice it. But I think just take that phenomena and exaggerate it for dyslexics. So when they're listening, because their computer reads it back to them and they actually hear what is on the page, not what they think is on the page, because in their head, they have the commas, because in their head they read it the way that they want it to sound, even if there's no comma there. So when the computer reads it back, they say, hey, that sounds funny. The computer isn't taking a breath. Wow, it looks like I have one long sentence for my entire essay. So very often, if a dyslexic was looking at their paper, they would have noticed that. But when they hear it, that makes a big difference.
Okay, Ellie, so we're moving on to the inspiration round. Could you share with us your proudest moment?
Well, really, you know what? I get so proud and moved when I get the emails from my podcast listeners. Really, it moves me to tears. People open up and share so much of their life and their journey and their process. And I really feel like we're in it together. And that is very, very, very special. And it's really an honor for me to be able to hold this space for people.
So awesome that you're adding value to those people's lives and touching them. So it might actually link into this next question that I'm about to ask you, which is, what are your sources of inspiration?
So I am a big believer in inspiration, and I am an inspiration junkie. I love the way it feels to be lit up from the inside out. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan of books, and because I have a very difficult time reading, I do almost exclusively audiobooks, and I love it. So I listen to so many different books from so many different genres, often nonfiction, although not exclusively, which has me very inspired.
Awesome. So this might link in a little bit to this next question, which is, from a personal working habit point of view, as a dyslexic individual, what would you say is your personal work habit that gets you through the day?
So I found out that the quality of my work changes drastically as the day goes on. And I think because of the dyslexic processing style that has a difficult time automating some tasks that come more automatically to other people, for example, like driving in the very beginning when you're first learning how to drive, or other tasks, I think at the end of the day, I do get more tired. Like organization takes just a little bit extra focused attention. So what gets me through the day is making sure that I put the most difficult things that I have to do right at the beginning, when I'm in a good, cheerful mood and after a good night's sleep, and that has been very effective. And high-grade, high-quality coffee is also a fantastic compliment.
So you've also given us lots of resources and ideas, and you've touched on a couple of books that I know I'm going to be putting in the show notes page. But the final question that I'd like to ask you is, what resource as a book would you recommend?
So I would encourage every teacher that is listening to this, from preschool level tell university professors and beyond that I highly encourage them to read the very fascinating, engaging, easily to listen to book called The Dyslexic Advantage by Brock and Fernette Eide. I actually had Brock on my show, and it's a book about the dyslexic mind, but it doesn't read like a cognitive science textbook. It's an easy and compelling read, and I think it will really help you understand the dyslexic individual that may come into your life.
Ellie, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's been awesome just quickly jumping into what knowledge you've got on this subject.
Pleasure, absolutely.
Before we say goodbye, Ellie, if our listeners want to get in contact with you and reach out to you further, what's the best way?
So I'm all over social media. You can see my work on my site, which is elishevashwartz.com, and you can reach out and contact me via my Twitter account, Facebook account. I'm on Instagram.
Thank you for joining us today on Inspiration for Teachers. For more resources, tips, and advice, visit our website, inspirationforteachers.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would love to connect with you. Just click like on our Facebook page at facebook.com/inspirationforteachers.